Yeah, no worries. So I've got the task of going through some item analysis and helping us better understand how to use test analytics within our I2 environment. It's been a really interesting process for me to go through that process to better understand it, because I was probably like a lot of people where in my role as an ED or online learning designer, you tend to build the test and then it gets deployed and off you go. Whereas this kind of approach really helps us to complete the loop in terms of understanding how our students are engaging with those tests, and I think it delivers some potentially really useful information. It might help us improve our teaching and learning over the journey. So I might just start that so it's easier for the recording to pick up. And if there's any questions, please sing out, because I'm finding a little bit blind in terms of seeing people's faces on my monitor for some reason today. So please feel free to interrupt. It's probably a good time for me at the start to acknowledge, even though I'm presenting solo today, Danny Murphy, an academic from the School of Accounting and Finance, was really generous with his time in terms of talking through what his approach is to using this kind of analytical approach in the tests that he deploys. He's got two subjects which, for the purposes of today's presentation, I've mashed up a couple of images, but rest assured that the approach I'm sort of articulating is one that Danny very much follows within his subjects. And obviously like to thank Ian and Stuart and Lynn as well for some feedback on slides and content as well. So for those people who may be watching the recording or here today, obviously the tests and surveys tool allows you to create online quizzes, tests, exams, etc. that include both automatically and instructor marked questions, and they enable you to test for summative or formative purposes, and you can obviously use them to check knowledge and skill of your students. But what we're looking at today, obviously, is to explore the ways in which information from the test analysis functionality within I2 can support teaching and learning practices. And we'll also note some of the limitations that currently exist within the I2 test analysis environment. Then I just might do a little stop and check there. I just wanted to double check that you're not seeing the Zoom task or toolbar in my share screen.
No, we're just seeing the slides. Just seeing the slides, Jed. Yeah, thank you.
No worries. So that question, and this was probably one that I potentially started with, and it's like, well, why would I want to run an analysis of my test? And the more I got to thinking about it, it became really apparent that it sort of presented a really interesting opportunity to CSU and ergo academics within CSU to really look at how we can deploy tests in a range of different ways. But of course, we know that they're widely used across all areas of CSU, and they do carry a significant burden of auto marking, so they can, if they're set up properly, really be used in quite a clever way to capture some of that assessment load in the form of self-marked quizzes and so forth. We often see them used as a first assessment, or as we call them early low stakes assessment, and sometimes using parallel with that notion of ensuring students have engaged early in a subject, so the task is set nice and early, and there might be a 10-question quiz or whatever it might be. We want to obviously do some sort of analysis on tests, because the insights derived can support effective learning design, which is what we're going to talk about in a little bit, and obviously supports effective assessment and moderation processes, and obviously for those reasons as well as for student experience. Well-designed tests are pretty important kinds of things for us to be focusing on. Okay, so how do I actually run an analysis? I've got a couple of images after this, but just to say that you can only and this is probably self-apparent, but you can only run a test analysis on a deployed test only. You need to have the right sort of permission within the subject, so you need to have that grade level of access to run that kind of analysis. It can be run by accessing the test from 3 locations, so the content area, a list of deployed tests, or the grade center. And reading through, and this was something which we talk about a little bit more later on, but it's worth noting now, is that best practice seems to be that idea of running analysis when attempts are completed and any manually marked test components have obviously been marked. I did come across from other institutions, particularly overseas, cases of tests being altered whilst students were doing them. So if they saw a question which was too difficult or too easy, that question was altered. But I think that throws up some very interesting questions in terms of assessment integrity and so forth. But it was possible that they may have been using those in quite a formative sort of way and encouraging students to have multiple attempts. But it was just something which I thought was worth noting. And just again, a little screen grab just from Danny's subject, which, you know, one of his subjects I should say, where just to show the ways, particularly for those watching on the recording, that you can see that the online test there on the left hand side has been deployed in a content area. So click on that, click through to the test itself, and then obviously you can click through to that drop down menu where you'll see an option there called the item analysis. Again, just to really drill in for those people who are watching on recording particularly, but that you can then click on that. Once you do what's called running the analysis, you can then obviously see the result there, and it opens up a wealth of information for you to have a look at, which we'll get into now. Okay, so what's within Blackboard Test Analytics, and I've focused on what I view to be the most important aspects of it. There's, for those stats heads out there, there's probably those who could talk much more effectively about standard deviations and all that sort of stuff. But I've focused on, I guess I've taken a bit of a use approach to what you can actually get out of this kind of thing. So when you run an analysis within Blackboard or Interact 2 tests, you'll see information relating to aggregate achievement. So overall, what has the cohort done? And this will give you an insight into the overall, I've used those words interchangeably, but they do mean different things. The quality of the test as determined by, you know, the formulas that Blackboard put into their analytical reports. You can also see the overall results on a test. You can see the quality, and again I've put that in inverted commas, of an individual question, and the ability of an individual question to act as an indicator of overall achievement on the test. And they've got some specific terminology around those. So when you've run that, again to follow through on Danny's, in Danny's subject there, ACT 515, you can see here, this is the high level of running an analysis, and you get what's called a summary page. And so this is quite a short sort of test in some ways, or not short, but the questions are quite low stakes individually, but they add up to quite a substantial task for students to achieve, if that makes sense. And the structure of the test itself has some interesting implications for your ability to use these stats at a high level, or whether you need to do some manual handling of them, as I'll demonstrate with what Danny does there. But just to provide you, obviously you can see the possible points available in the test, and from memory I think each of Danny's questions here were worth 0.25. There's 60 possible questions there, but not every question is obviously, in this situation, it mightn't be so obvious, but not every question is presented to students. There's some banks of questions or pools of questions, and the system will randomly allocate particular questions to students. You can see obviously there's no in progress attempts there, which is pretty important. You can see that 14 students have completed that test so far with an average score of 3.95, and it took them 47 minutes to do. Over on the closest to the right hand side, you'll see that table there called discrimination, and it says that there's, according to the system, 18 good questions, there's 2 fair questions, there's 1 poor question, and 39 questions that couldn't actually calculate the discrimination factor. And again, right across to the right, which is probably the easiest one to understand, but again has some interesting implications, is the difficulty level, which was 35 easy questions, 13 medium and 12 hard there, and with some filter options as well. So that's the summary. But drilling down here again into deriving some question-specific insights into what's going on in this particular test. So I've just chosen one question here, which was out of the bank of questions, and it's that. So students were asked to answer 20 questions, and the questions are presented in terms of, in this environment, the analysis is conducted on an individual level. And this was one of the interesting limitations in getting an understanding of this from Danny. A lot of the tests that he runs are actually tests which will provide a scenario type of question to students with a heap of information, so financial information, and then there might be perhaps sometimes 10, 15 or even 20 different possible questions that students have to answer based on that one scenario. So it could be a pool of 20 questions, but students may only have to answer 5 of them. And in some cases that can throw the data out a little bit, because it might be that one of those 20 questions only gets used twice for, in this case, the 14 students. So it's a bit hard to actually tell whether a particular question within a broader bank was good or bad, if only, in this case, 2 out of the 14 students actually used it. So in terms of this particular question, it's saying that this was a poor question in terms of discriminating, and that discrimination, which we'll talk about more in the next page, is the ability of a particular question to point to how well a student may do overall on the test. It said that the difficulty level was easy. 6 people were presented with this question, and the average score was 0.21, obviously with standard deviation and standard error stats presented there as well. And so you can see that you can get some really interesting insights, but there are some limitations depending on how the questions are structured themselves. So just wanted to pick up on the item discrimination. What does this mean? And like I said in that last slide there, item discrimination measures the effectiveness of a question to actually discriminate between overall stronger and weaker performance on the test. I think this stat is pretty useful because it actually allows you to investigate the difficulty of a question as in relative terms, and also allows you to see did students on the test who achieved quite well do well on this particular question, or vice versa for those students who perhaps scored more poorly. And I think the step on from that is you start to be able to determine key pieces of content or knowledge in terms of understanding, I call them potential tripwires. What are the concepts that a student may trip up on? And you start to be able to talk next about resourcing and providing some scaffolds for students in terms of moving them forward through particular pieces of content. It's important to note discrimination value isn't calculated when there's actually nothing to discriminate. So if all students get the question right or wrong, or if they all get the same result, there's nothing to discriminate. So therefore it will tell you that indeed there's there's nothing here to really tell you in terms of the bigger picture and how students will go on the test as a whole. And in my mind, it was one of the things that I sort of deleted off my slides, was that idea. In other words, the simple message is success on a particular question indicative of overall student achievement on the test as a whole? So I think that, again, in the presentation in a couple of slides time, talk about it, the way Danny uses that kind of information is pretty interesting. Again, just particularly for the purposes of the recording, just to sort of really zoom in on what this means, is that within the system, it'll present you a discrimination value, and essentially it considers a question, and there's a whole, I haven't included the whole formula, it's quite reasonably detailed in terms of how it works that out, but essentially it spits out a value of good, fair or poor. As you can see, the values listed there, and we have just previously talked about that cannot calculate result. Excuse me, well, I'll just grab a quick drink of water. So item difficulty is another key measure, which is essentially, this tells you how many students have found a question easy or difficult. And really, it allows you an efficient way of quickly evaluating if a question achieved what you designed it to do. I want to link back to the point that I made earlier on in the presentation about sometimes tests are actually designed as that early low stakes, get students in, get them into an assessment frame of mind, get them focused on what they need to do to pass the subject. And it may be actually that a test is relatively easy, and I guess it's a little note of caution, which again talk about in a moment, about actually understanding the intent of your questions, or understanding the intent of a question on a particular test. It may be that a test is actually designed to be relatively low level and straightforward for students to complete, and that you've just used it to engage them in the early reading, and it may be that the analysis it comes out that it's telling you that the difficulty is it's too easy, and if you are designing a test to indeed engage students early and so forth, it may be that you don't want to change that particular test. So the learning design, the intent of that is really quite important to consider in all of this sort of information that you can actually get from the system. So just to, again, in talking with Danny, his experiences of the limitations of the test analysis tools in I2 currently. So it doesn't export the results as a Excel CSV spreadsheet. In Danny's case, he likes to make the effort to, and again I'll show you in the next slide an image of what he does. He likes to take that effort because the way he designs his tests, grouping similar skills and knowledge, that he wants to get that inside of what's happening in a bank of questions or in a particular scenario that he puts forward to students. As I said there, one of the limitations is it doesn't handle the pool or the block questions that effectively. So and further to that is that if a particular option within a bank or a pool of questions isn't really utilised by the system in that random allocation to students, it might present some slightly sort of skewed data. It did have one aspect, and I don't know whether perhaps after the presentation Ian or Stuart might have a comment on this, but there was one instance of a subject that I'd worked with previously where it presented me with a higher average than the total points within a subject. As yet, it was isolated, but as yet I haven't seen why that occurred. Haven't got down to the bottom of that yet, and my only thought so far was that there may have been a test in progress and that it had considered that, but it's something that as with a lot of analytics, as we find out more about it, we find out potential bugs or limitations. I guess that's part of this kind of presentation as well, is to sort of note those aspects as we go and try and understand them and use the information in the light of where the system is at in a whole. So I said to Lynn when she asked me to do this, I'd try and also talk about this idea of crossing the bridge from just having the information or having the end results and actually using them to understand and hopefully inform learning design. And my thoughts are, before we can just talk briefly about Danny's approach, is that because we're dealing with results, I thought a logical place to start is using the information to, as you do when you get these, interpret student achievement, use the interpretation to, excuse me while I move my pages, use the interpretation to modify teaching approaches and to construct feed-forward environment for students, and to construct a more nuanced understanding of how blocks of questions, particularly those ones based on scenarios that might be quite complex, perform in that test environment. And like I sort of alluded to in one of those other statements, modify or enhance some learning design. Just go into, so I've referred to Danny a couple of times, and what he actually does is that he has a couple of subjects where he utilises tests to actually carry some of his assessment load, but he also uses tests to support students in some self-evaluation and to practice before they submit an assessment for real. One of the things that I found really quite interesting was that once Danny's formal assessments are finished, he'll actually pull all of this data out and he'll actually analyse his questions with the use of an Excel spreadsheet, so that you can see there, and I'm pointing at my computer screen, which doesn't help you watching, but there's that first block of questions in that graphic there, and he actually manipulates the data into this kind of form, so it makes it more user-friendly than from within Interact 2, and he can actually sort of say, all right, okay, that difficulty level within that first particular block was 24%, so it was reasonably hard for students to get through. But you can sort of see there that even within those options, there's some quite sort of marked difference in the discrimination of particular questions. And you might say that a student, as an example, if they get presented with the first two options, that it shows that they're a bit harder, but if you get that third one, that up at 40%, perhaps it's a little bit easier. So you start understanding, quite clearly, what's the student, experiencing in terms of the cognitive demand of a particular question or otherwise. So presented into this kind of this kind of format. I've just blown that up there for the benefit of the recording. But then moving onwards, Danny also presents back to students this information in the form of narrated practice questions for students, where he'll draw their attention to the fact that the last time this subject ran, for example, only 38.5% of online students got similar questions on process costing correct. Then, so the students have the opportunity to, okay, that's, I need to really stop and think about this sort of thing. Then Danny presents them with a practice question there, but he also then gives them the chance to work through, but provides them with a narrated solution after they've had a go at the practice test as well, and does this for each particular type of question, sort of gives them the stats on what students have found easy or difficult, and then this sort of completes that loop to them. And I can actually go here's where I wanted to actually get to, and you can sort of see that he's included this notion of student self-assessment and awareness all the way through his learning design. So you can see there that for each topic there's a self-assessment test all the way through the subject, and I haven't taken a screenshot of it, but within this particular subject there's then actual tests which carry assessment load as well. So I'll just skip back one slide. So just some broader approaches in terms of tests, as I've just called it for today, information informed learning design, and building a little bit on the notion of what Danny's sort of providing there in terms of you could use this kind of information to provide weekly, regular check your understanding mini tests, provide students with the opportunity to pick up on misconceptions earlier and redirect them to important activities or knowledge or skill refinement. We've called this that notion of making learning visible, which is really what I think Danny's doing there in terms of providing students with this feedback of, hey, here's a bit of a signpost for the fact that historically students have found this particular concept or skill or piece of knowledge quite difficult. Therefore, I'm telling you, really focus on that, and I'm going to provide some scaffolds for you to get through it. And I sort of, in my own mind, call that a set of, I wonder whether that could even be a set of mile markers to say to students up front, historically, here's where the challenges have been, and here's some particular strategies to sort of move through those pieces of knowledge or skill. I also think you could use this kind of information to enhance that notion of teacher presence by using that kind of thing to start off regular Adobe Connect sessions. You could construct some kind of seminar session around addressing the most common misconceptions, so that idea of feedback, but also feed forward. And again, as Danny does, actually it goes across sessions, so utilising what he's learned about how students learn to inform subsequent teaching in the next session. And again, this idea of adaptive teaching, it's that extra resourcing or redirection based on results of specific questions. So perhaps the student has done really quite well on a particular test or practice test, but then there's one particular area that you can really clearly see as a result that they have struggled on, and there'd be ways again to manipulate that data within, for example, Excel. You could provide students with some targeted resourcing without, I guess, going down the rabbit hole today of what that could look like, but it may be additional module content or and of course it could beg the question, you could provide that in the first instance, but it is just ways of considering what might be targeted after students have an awareness of what they do and don't know or understand as well. So, I've called this some final notes, but hopefully or possibly some questions or comments. I guess wanted to say that tests are part of the assessment mix. They're used to, as we've talked about, or I've talked about, I should say, they're used for some varying degrees and for different purposes. And like I mentioned early on, they can be used as a hook for early engagement, which may result in tests having low discrimination factors. My note was that I think we'd want to be really wary about going down. I don't suspect that people would, but just an awareness that we don't necessarily want to design every test to have this neat kind of bell curve kind of effect. And I'm sure people out there could probably describe that better than me, but we don't need to necessarily make all tests difficult. They've just got to be appropriate for the intent that you had when you built it in the first place. Second last comment would be that the analysis is obviously, I think, only as good as the quality of the questions, the teaching and materials. And I've noted teaching twice. That's how keen I was to emphasise that. And obviously the student effort. One of the things Danny said was that he's had more than one case where he's had students he knows haven't engaged and have just got lucky and guessed. And he said the analysis doesn't account for that. That's just students taking a bit of a chance. Those sorts of things can slightly skew the analysis as well. So the point being, focusing only on the test questions is likely to have some limited effectiveness. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but to finish, it's not normally possible here to edit tests whilst they're active. So that's a bit of a limitation on that notion of using it to inform the assessment design whilst the test is deployed, but it's probably a learning that you would apply. I called it post facto. So the next time the test is offered, you might want to review what happened and improve the questions. And my only workaround to that was that if a question was shown to be misleading or confusing, it might be a case where that question is disregarded or otherwise dealt with in some kind of way in the assessment or moderation process. For those people, where can I find out more? I've tried to just focus on the highest level things today around the difficulty in discrimination and what that might look like as you start out, or if you're keen to sort of think about how you can use those lessons in teaching and learning design. There is an adaptive learning and teaching team here, obviously, via Cass and Ian and Stuart, I know, have their heads in that space in particular, but obviously myself as presenting today, and of course we have our SRS, our service request system, and educational designers who would also be able to point you in the right direction. So I'm not sure where my timing's at there, Lynn, but I feel like I might be close.
Yep. No, we've just gone over 1 o'clock. Yep. So I would just like to quickly open it to any burning questions that anyone might have at this stage.
It's very interesting, Jed, but I don't have any particular question at the moment.
That's right.
Yeah, I think from mine, it's just been really understanding what's possible, but also understanding that, like any tool, it's by no means the finished product or perfect, and you've got to use it with that awareness of that. And it was particularly when I started talking with Danny, where he was saying, well, it's good, but I have to do a fair bit of manual manipulation to actually make this work for my circumstances because of the nature of his content, and he's asking students to think in quite detailed ways and to understand some pretty complex sorts of things. So I found that just really talking through that with him, and I suspect that with a lot of our analytical tools that's the sort of response that we'll get, that this has got to work for me, and if it doesn't work for me, I find some interesting ways to make it. So
yeah. No, look, that's actually been really valuable, I think, Jed, because it's certainly the example was also a really good example, I think, too, because there's obviously a lot of knowledge and application of knowledge for those students in completing that kind of test that you've used as the example, which is really interesting. And just the looking at the difficulty rating and the discrimination was really interesting. So that's certainly something that I think it's useful to have. I can see it would be useful to have academics partnering with another academic who's actually come up with a system that works for them. So thank you.